Oh howdy all, grab yourself a drink, it is time for some PathOfExile discussion. Welcome to the big day for patch 3.23. About 12 hours ago, Grinding Gear Games debuted the trailer for patch 3.23 and the Affliction League. The Affliction League itself was part of that, but there's also a number of big changes coming to the core game. And honestly, this video is mostly going to be about things that do affect Standard as well, because there's a number of systems, Metamorph, Heist alternate quality gems, and also Labyrinth enchants, that are all getting reworked so thoroughly that they're basically not recognizable anymore in this patch. Now what I wanted to do with this video is put out a bit of an FAQ responding to questions I've seen asked a lot about the patch so far, and also I wanted to respond to common misconceptions about the patch. That said, it's important to note that there's likely to be mistakes in this video. For example, if you watch the 6-hour live stream where I went through all of the patch notes, and I'll put a link to that down in the description of this video, then you'll see that there's a few times that chat corrected me. Partly this is because it's an exhausting day for content creators. It can be difficult to maintain focus for many hours while you're going through things. But also with the PathOfExile community, it is the case that sometimes there'll be a consensus that takes a while to emerge around a particular skill or ascendancy, and sometimes no consensus emerges as well. Lastly, it's still early days. Things can and will change about these answers, and it wouldn't surprise me if there are some updates to the patch notes over the next week. Anyways, let's start with a very quick overview of some of the Affliction-specific features. There are going to be new Pseudo-Ascendancies that are being added. The most commonly asked question that I'm seeing is, do these replace your existing Ascendancies? Am I required to be one of these new Ascendancies like a Primalist of the Wild in place of being, for example, a Raider? The answer is no. You take one of these new Pseudo-Ascendancies that are tied to the League mechanic and probably represent borrowed power, and these stack with the Ascendancies that you normally gain. These two progression systems advance separately from each other, but you'll get the power from both of them simultaneously. And if you're wondering what those charm sockets do, they're for inserting objects like the Occultist Corvine Charm of the Inquisitor that you see here into them. These are essentially maybe a 12%, 15% version of an Ascendancy notable. That's the prefix, and then there is a suffix which is also a roughly 12 to 15% version of an Ascendancy notable. Sometimes it's a bit more than that. For example, on the Occultist Corvine Charm here, that first mod, Cursed Enemies you and your minions kill have a 13% chance to Chaos Explode. This is actually 26% as good as the Occultist node that people like, Profane Bloom. Note that these charms come from the League mechanic. They cannot be crafted, but they can be traded to other players. They're also only available if you elect to go with the Primalist of the Wild. If you go with one of the other options, then you'll not have access to these charms. Although, of course, you can respec into the Primalist of the Wild if you get really good charms later. Next, there's the Warden of the Magi, and I'll put a link down in the description below to where Grinding Gear Games put their press kit, and that has these full images on it. This is an alternative Affliction Ascendancy analog, so this is something else that you can take instead of the one that we were looking at before. It does have some oddball items as well. You can apply tinctures to your equipped weapons. These take up a flask slot but are not flasks. They're different to flasks, and they're again something you'll be able to pick up from the vendors from this new League mechanic. And this is the third of these Pseudo-Ascendancies, the Warlock of the Mist. Now, your first step into these Pseudo-Ascendancies will be about Act 5. Your second and third are meant to be very accessible to all players. Not necessarily super quickly, but probably by the time you do your Eternal Labyrinth, you should have the third one of these new Ascendancies. The final step requires beating a boss that is comparable in difficulty to Lycia in the Sanctum. So not a cakewalk, but not something that's particularly difficult either. Alright, so there is a gem systems overhaul that's happening. There are going to be massive buffs to the quality stats on active gems. Now this is not to support gems, this is to active gems. For example, the quality on Lightning Conduit, and we'll come to this later because it's something that is on my shortlist of a potential starter, the quality on Lightning Conduit is getting gigabuffed. Alternate qualities are being completely replaced by a new system, and this is not in Heist, this is going to be something that is in the Labyrinth. When you complete the Labyrinth, you'll get access to the new version of the Divine Font. This will have different crafts to the ones you're familiar with, so instead of having enchants like it does in the current version of the game, enchants just won't exist at all, and you'll be able to transform a skill gem into a transfigured gem. Transfigured gems are the new alternate qualities, but they are not the same as alternate qualities. Essentially, where the alternate qualities keep the same base stats of the gem, the transfigured gems keep only the theme of the gem, and all of the other stats are up in the air. Concrete example, it's at the more extreme end. There is Raise Zombie of Falling, where instead of causing a zombie to get up from the ground and start attacking your enemies, it conjures a corpse in the air above enemies, which then falls down and promptly goes splat. Now, of course, if you do cast this gem, you are morally obligated to start singing Let the Bodies Hit the Floor, or alternately, It's Raining Men, which are just the same song, but told from a different viewpoint. The only thematic link between Raise Zombie and Raise Zombie of Falling is that they are conceptually linked to the concept of summoning a zombie. The actual gems are entirely different. Now, one of these crafts here transforms a skill gem to be a random transfigured gem of the same color. For example, you might put in the blue gem Fireball and then receive back the blue gem Lightning Spire Trap. Are the same gem XP and the same quality, I believe, as the Fireball you inputted. However, that Lightning Spire Trap that you get is going to be transfigured. That means it won't do what a normal Lightning Spire Trap does. It'll do whatever transfigured Lightning Spire Trap does, which is essentially a new gem. There's going to be about 100 of these gems going live on day one, and there may continue to be more of them after that. We don't have details of very many of them yet. The second one of these crafts transforms a skill gem into itself, but transfigured. So here, if you put in Fireball, you're going to get transfigured Fireball, whatever transfigured Fireball ends up being. Then you have some other crafts that are not about transfiguring. So add 16 quality to a gem and sacrifice a gem to gain a Facetor's Lens out of it. Very important to note, there is a recipe that has been used by players for a long time where you input a level 20 gem and also a single gem cutter's prism, and the game returns you a level 1 version of that gem that is 20 quality. That is no longer going to apply to skill gems, to active gems. It will still apply to support gems, and support gems generally don't get as much from quality, but for your active gems, you might consider running Labyrinth in order to get this extra additional quality here. Now, very important little note, I do not believe that this makes for Lab Runner League. Across the whole Trade League economy, I think that there'll be a smaller number of Labyrinth runs that are going to be needed. Maybe this is not the case in Solo Self-Found, but in Trade Leagues, it is actually going to be easier to get your special quality gems than it was in 3.22. This is because in 3.22, there were two pieces you wanted to get together. You wanted your specific gem to have the correct variant of its alternate quality on it, and on top of that, you also probably wanted to have the right helmet enchantment on your helmet. Now, a lot of people may do without their helmet enchantment. It kind of depended upon the skill you were playing as to how important that was. But now that these systems are merged together and both in Labyrinth, it's likely to be easier to get it in the Labyrinth than it was just to get the enchant component, and you also don't need to get that specific skill gem out of Heist. Finally, there's going to be a lot of undesired skill gems that get created by accident out of this Divine Font system. For example, let's say that Bob is trying to make a specific transfigured version of Fireball. Bob then takes a bunch of Fireball gems in, but some of the runs that he doesn't get transform your Fireball gem into a transfigured version of that gem. Instead, he transforms his Fireball gem to get a random transfigured gem of the same color, and winds up getting an undesired for him Wave of Conviction. But if this is in Trade League, Bob can then turn around and potentially sell that transfigured Wave of Conviction to someone else that is actually looking for that particular gem. Essentially, there's a lot more liquidity on these items than there was on Labyrinth enchants, because if someone had a particular helmet enchant they often wanted it not just on a specific base, but maybe even on their specific well-rolled base as well. That requirement is entirely gone now, and so for that reason, I think that less Labyrinth runs are going to be needed across the entire league than were needed previously, and there will be less space for people who are dedicated Labyrinth runners. That said, there may be some rare outcomes from the Divine Font that do justify serious lab running. That's something we'll have to see as to whether that turns up. I anticipate having all the things that I want out of the Labyrinth done pretty quickly. Now, I will be playing in Trade League. It might take 8 or 10 runs of the hardest Labyrinth you can do at the time if you're wanting to get the perfect transfigured gem for your build in Solo Self-Found. The only time it's going to take a lot more than that, though, is if you want to get a huge number of them in order to mass corrupt them, or to use Doriani's Institute to double corrupt them. In that situation, you might want to run Lab a bit more, but I think we'll be seeing less total runs across the Trade League of the Labyrinth in 3.23 than we saw of Gem Heist in 3.22, much less Gem Heist and Labyrinth runs for enchants combined. Okay, so the next question I want to tackle is what's happening with Sanctum-Induced inflation. Patch 3.22 saw a lot of items that are in high demand amongst the very wealthiest players in PathOfExile be much more expensive than usual. This is noticeable on Mageblood, but also on Headhunter, also on access to the 5-way domain of Timeless Conflict, and a whole bunch of other things that the wealthiest players in the game are interested in trading for. This is something that was a net positive for some players and net negative for others. But the key reason this happened was that Sanctum was pumping so many raw Divine Orbs into the Trade League economy. It wasn't just Sanctum, it was Tota as well, but Sanctum was the main offender. Now, the nerfs to Sanctum that are happening in patch 3.23. The first one is a reduction to the drop rate of the Hour of Divinity and the Gilded Chalice unique relics. These are the single-use relics that can double one of your offer rewards. There was a really widely seen clip of someone getting 8 Mirrors of Kalandra from a whole bunch of these. Now that was a complete and utter miracle drop. Most of the time though, these are duplicating Divine Orbs instead. So the reduction in the drop rate of these means a reduction in the amount of Divine Orbs that very experienced Sanctum farmers are getting per run of the Sanctum. But probably more significant, reduce the drop rate of Forbidden Tomes. We don't know how much this drop rate has been nerfed. What we can do is consider the effect that extreme ends of this spectrum could have. If the drop rate was decreased by only 10%, then I think we're going to see a pretty similar economy to last league, with only a slight reduction in the impact that Sanctum has on inflation across the league. On the flip side, let's consider a world where grinding gear games dial this nerf up to 11, and they reduce the drop rate of Forbidden Tomes from a drop rate of 260 to a drop rate of 13. So that makes it something like Doctor Rarity. Now I don't think they should do this for a second, but if that were to happen, the impact would be that Forbidden Tomes, their role in the league economy would be something like really, really rare consumables, like Einhar's Memory of Harvest Beasts. These are something that you probably only see once in a league if you're lucky, and when you do get it, you turn around and you sell it to someone that's really specialized in the content. I think the happy medium is somewhere right in the middle of these two, probably something like a 50% drop rate nerf on the Forbidden Tomes themselves. If that were to happen, Sanctum runners are still going to be generating a lot of Divine Orbs, but they're going to have to spend more of these, getting into bidding wars with other Sanctum runners in order to buy those Forbidden Tomes that are around. This is going to mean that the wealth that comes out of the Sanctum is going to be spread out to people who are running a diverse set of content. If you're running Delve and you get a tome drop, if you're running Heist, you get a tome drop, if you're mapping and you get a tome drop, you can then sell it to one of these Sanctum specialists, but because there's fewer of them dropping, you can then charge them more for it. That's where I think I'd like to see things, a drop weight of 120 to 130, whereas it's 260 in 3.22. Moving off Sanctum and back to some of the changes that are happening to gems. You may have noticed that Heist is losing some of its chase rewards at the moment. However, it's also going to be picking up some new ones. What's going to be the loot that's tied to Heist? Well, it's getting a few new chase drops. I don't think Badge of the Brotherhood is necessarily a chase drop, but I do think the Simplex Amulet is incredible. Simplex Amulet is doubling down on what it does well. Instead of being plus 25% increased explicit modifier magnitudes, it's going to be plus 100%. However, it is losing one more prefix. What this means is that Simplex Amulets now have exactly one spot for a prefix, which should be the Exalter's mod. Exalter's mod being +1 to the level of all skill gems. Once you've got that, there's a number of crafting methods you can use to go further with the amulet. I do think that these Simplex Amulets are going to be chase, and I do think that the base itself is going to be quite expensive. So do keep that in mind if you're planning around these. I don't think they're going to be easy to get your hands on at all, because they do so much and they're also quite easy to craft. Another thing that might be interesting with the Simplex Amulet, I'd be interested in seeing what exactly happens if you were to hit these with Veiled Chaos Orbs. I think there is a lot of potential there. There's also Replica Covenant, which is going to be added. This is the best screenshot I was able to get of it, which is not particularly great. Unfortunately, the only teaser Grinding Gear Games have given is in one of the videos that they've put up. But Replica Covenant is going to be a cold version, whereas the Covenant is the Chaos version, and it's going to drain your energy shield rather than your life. This is an interesting thing because level 29 added cold damage provides a very, very, very large amount of flat added cold. A lot of people jump to that and think, oh, that's just worse than Awakened added cold. That's actually not the case. Level 29 added cold damage will in most circumstances provide a lot more damage than level 5 Awakened added cold does. Awakened added cold does add +1 gem level, but the flat damage is so much higher on level 29 that it's probably better overall. In order to use this robe, however, you're going to need to have extremely severe energy shield recovery, or you're going to need to be playing with a skill that you can fire off once and then wait for quite some time. Now, Ultimatum is replacing Metamorph, both on the Atlas and in the base game. Metamorph is being entirely removed. The unique reward from it, Catalysts, are being transferred over to Ultimatum. The single most asked question I've seen is what happens to my existing Metamorph tab if you own the Metamorph tab. The existing Metamorph tab will transform into an Ultimatum tab. Instead of having space for holding organs of Metamorphs, it will instead have space to put in inscribed Ultimatums. Ultimatum will function fairly similarly to how it did in patch 3.14. Honestly, my suggestion for Ultimatum is give it a try if you don't know what's involved in it. Just test it out a little bit in play because it's fairly intuitive once you play with it for a while. It's also very, very dangerous and very, very easy to fail. But it's something that you'll learn pretty quickly because the mechanics are quite intuitive on it. Ultimatum also has some really silly items tied to it. Ixchel's Temptation here, this ring is probably not very good, but it has the interesting text, maximum quality is 200%, and it's always corrupted. That doesn't sound very useful, except for the fact that there is now a Tainted Catalyst. The Tainted Catalyst rerolls two things. Firstly, it rerolls the quality type on a corrupted item, and secondly, it rerolls the level of quality on it. So it can be anywhere from 0 to 20 normally, but on Ixchel's Temptation, anywhere from 0 to 200%, which could be a little bit of fun. That said, I don't think this item is very good. It just looks like more of a meme item. Okay, there's been a lot of questions about Righteous Fire. Is it gutted? Is it destroyed? Is it still okay? Now, I think the skill is not dead, but it has to be built differently. Unfortunately for Pox, all of the guides that he's put out over the last year or so are pretty much no longer relevant. That said, Pox is a smart guy. He will come up with replacements for them if he decides to continue playing Righteous Fire. Now, I don't think that this is a very strong league start choice anymore. It's going to be a skill that will become solid again, but where it's going to fall way behind its performance in 3.22 is going to be when you get to early endgame and your character's life is really low, but your gem levels are starting to raise up. That's because Righteous Fire is losing all of its flat damage that it does, and it's instead gaining a larger amount that is based upon your character's life plus your character's energy shield. So you're going to need to start scaling life and energy shield on your character rather than focusing on scaling gem levels. So Righteous Fire is going to be pushing you towards scaling your life and your energy shield, but your other skill gems, the ones that you use in order to do burst damage to bosses, these are still going to want those gem levels. In short, you're going to have more pressure on your gear, there's more stats you're going to want to be putting together, and you're going to end up having to make more compromises early in gearing. But once you're able to solve all those compromises, the build is going to come together again at the top end. However, Ivory Tower builds probably replace all existing Righteous Fire builds, at least at medium investment and up. Now, Ivory Tower is tier 3 rarity in patch 3.22, at least according to reports that I've had of it dropping in Ritual for about 2,800 tribute, but who knows what it's going to be like in the future. We will find all of that out when the patch goes live, and that's another reason that Righteous Fire is a bit of a dubious starting choice. That's been the most common question I've had today. What do people think of RF? And that's my answer. The build is fine, but it's going to be much worse when your character is like level 65 through 85. But then once you start putting a few hundred chaos into it, I think you'll be able to get it working pretty well again. Alright, this is not the melee buff we wanted to see. Heatshiver was the glue that was holding Frostblades and Glacial Hammer together. It was keeping those things in the meta. Now, this was a crutch, and it wasn't ideal that these skills were dependent upon a broken helmet in order to function. But said broken helmet has been broken. The 100% of cold damage added as extra fire damage against frozen enemies is being gutted down to 30%. Now, no other melee skills except maybe Ground Slam jump out as replacements. And whilst non-melee Heatshiver builds can probably adapt, melee is the archetype where cold crit builds were so prevalent, were such a large percentage of the builds that were viable at the moment. With that in mind, I think Bone Shatter is now the only proven, tried and tested melee build that is known to be really good with the new changes that are going on. I do think it's possible Ground Slam gets there, but that is not guaranteed, and all the other melee builds were pretty reliant upon Heatshiver. So yes, Heatshiver has been gutted. Heatshiver may no longer be worth using on builds that were previously using it. What's up with Ashes of the Stars? So here's the text of the nerf that's taking place to Ashes of the Stars, and this is going to sound like a really severe one, the sort that might kill an item off entirely. However, that is not the case. The Ashes of the Stars unique amulet no longer provides 10 to 20% reservation efficiency of skills. Existing items can be updated with a Divine Orb and a momentary lapse in judgment, i.e. don't update them because you're going to regret it. So Ashes in 3.23 has strictly worse stats than it has in 3.22. Textbook case of a nerf, right? Well, not really, because there's been game system changes that make the text line 20 to 30% quality to all skill gems far more of a source of power than it was in patch 3.22. So what this means is that if you're playing in Standard, the best amulet for a lot of builds is going to be a Legacy Ashes of the Stars, one that dropped between patches 3.17 and patch 3.22. But if you're playing in the Affliction League, Legacy Ashes of the Stars don't exist, but there will be plenty of the new version of it. And in fact, because that 30 quality to all skill gems is now so much better than it used to be, Ashes is actually going to likely be more powerful and more dominant in the amulet slot than it was in patch 3.22. I think that Ashes of the Stars is going to be very commonly best in slot, and I think it's only a slight exaggeration to say that Ashes in patch 3.22 will be as good as Crystallized Omniscience was in patches 3.17 and 3.18. We will see if I'm right on that, but I am quite prepared to pay 50 Divines for my Ashes of the Stars, and this is going to be a league where I'm going to feel I need to get it. Now, similarly, Enhanced Support is much better than it used to be. For all the same reasons we've been discussing here, Enhanced Support is just a much more live gem than it has been for a long time, and Awaken Enhance is even better again. Crest of Desire is also looking incredibly good right now, and some of these pieces are going to come together when we start talking about builds that look like they have some potential in patch 3.23. Because one of the builds that's on my shortlist is one that uses all of these pieces. Ashes of the Stars, Crown of Desire, Enhanced Support, and also Thunderfist, which is something we haven't seen in a while. So that's kind of the end of the FAQ section. I just wanted to outline quickly the first build idea that I've had. Do not consider this to be a build that you can just go away and play now. This is the core structure around which a build can crystallize, but it is not something that you can say, hey, that's my league starter as yet. Lightning Conduit quality got buffed. The old version of 20 quality, 20% increased damage. The new version, 4% more damage with hits per 5% shock effect on enemy. Now this gem normally has 20% of that stat at gem level 20 and 21% for quite some time after that. So what this means is that at 20 quality, instead of 21% more damage against enemies that are shocked for 5%, it's going to be 25% more damage against those enemies. Against an enemy that's shocked for 35%, instead of 147% more damage, it's going to be 175% more damage. So that's a difference between going from 2.47 times base damage to 2.75 times base damage, i.e. a little bit more than a 10% more multiplier from having 20% quality on the gem. However, what happens if we scale this really, really high? Now, Crest of Desire. This item, if it's well rolled, can provide up to +8 to the level of socketed gems, and a well rolled Crest of Desire has to be an 8. If it's a 7, it's not well rolled. So you have to have an 8 there, and then 30 to 50 to quality of socketed gems. So let's say that you've got 40% there. This is going to be something like a 25% more damage from that shock line alone. On top of that, you've got the benefits of socketed skills deal double damage, and +8 to the level of socketed gems. In short, this is going to do some serious damage if you can inflict those shocks and make those shocks big. How do we make those shocks big? Because we want this 5% shock effect on enemy to be really high. Well, that's going to come down to Ashes of the Stars again, and this time we're going to be using it with a different gem. So, shock effect comes from Thunderfist, socketed with Shock Nova, linked to Enhance, and also getting the benefit of Ashes. And also getting the quality bonus from Ashes of the Stars, which is like a second copy of Enhance, or you can think of it as being a few extra levels on your Enhanced gem. That is going to allow you to then inflict some really, really big, really, really mean shocks, because Shock Nova now has a text, quality provides 10% to maximum effective shock at 20 quality. But we're not stopping at 20. If you've got Enhanced 4, that's 44. If you've got a perfectly rolled Ashes, that's 74. That means that you've got 37% added to your maximum effective shock, and because you're in Thunderfist with 100% increased effective lightning elements, and you've got this socketed gems as supported by level 30 added lightning damage, you might actually be able to land those Giga Shocks as well. So that's my thought process so far. Something else to keep in mind, and this is a real bonus, Crest of Desire is extremely mana friendly. You do not use very much mana with Crest of Desire at all, which is one less thing you've got to worry about when you're setting your character up. And with this setup, we also have ourselves at gem level 30. So that is 1 from Ashes, 21 from the gem itself, and 8 from our Crest of Desire. This is the soft cap for gem level, because after 30, scaling of spells slows down a lot with gem level. So at this point, our best in slot weapon is, of course, Divinarius. We don't need to compete with +2 weapons, because +2 weapons don't do very much for you once you're going beyond 30. Of course, Divinarius is very rare, Crest of Desire is very rare, and even rarer to get a good roll on it. Ashes of the Stars is very rare, and also Thunderfist isn't particularly common either. So there's a lot of things that are going to go right for this to come together. I don't have any plans as to how to level it and what to do until this point, but this is just something that I think might be appealing to play in patch 3.23, or at least to theorycraft once we get hard numbers on everything. Anyways, that's my first thoughts on patch 3.23 so far. May your Varlorbs have interesting results, and I will see you around.